Apparently so, yes.
Yes, we have to be serious. At least for you.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome, everybody. We're very pleased to have this discussion for you all tonight. Thank you for taking time to be here when it's raining and just an awful day. Just so you know, all of you, we are recording, so if you have an issue with that, please make sure that you're seated behind the camera where it won't catch it. All right. So we here, on behalf of the Review and Debates, I'm very proud and pleased to present our two distinguished thought leaders. We're going to begin, to my immediate left is Patrick Egan, an associate professor of politics and public policy at NYU, where he specializes in public opinion, political institutions, and their relationships in American politics. His current work includes research on Americans' experiences of climate change, the political attitudes of LGBT Americans, and politics and policies affecting inequality of opportunity in the U.S. Further to my left is Mary Kissel, a Wall Street Journal editor, board member, host of Opinion Journal on Wall Street Journal Video, and co-host of the Editorial Page's Foreign Edition podcast. An editorial writer and former foreign correspondent, she has reported from Europe, Asia Pacific, Australia, and America. Kissel joined the Journal in Hong Kong in 2004 as a financial columnist and served as Asia opinion editor from 2005 to 2010, directing commentary on more than 20 countries. She joined the New York editorial board in 2011, and her work promotes free markets and free peoples, in her own words. And with that, they're here to discuss what's next for America under Trump. As most of you probably know, assuming, the recent election ended with Donald Trump becoming president-elect. And there were many assumptions going into the election, and now there are many questions coming out of it. With that, we thought that this discussion tonight would help clarify some of those topics and set some other questions and motions into our community for discussion. So with that, we're going to begin with the first issue. So Patrick will begin with you, and then we'll go on to Mary by alphabetical order. And then we'll just reverse it, it's okay. But Patrick, according to you, what is the most pressing issue that the Trump administration must address?
Wow. That's a good question. I would say that probably the most pressing issue and probably the most difficult issue for President-elect Trump, and really Clinton had she been elected as well, is to figure out a way to mend and repair, I think, what a lot of Americans are experiencing as a deeply divided country. That's along the basis of race and ethnicity, it's along the basis of income, it's urban versus rural, it's gun owner versus gun controller. And I think probably the most important thing that the new president can do is figure out a way to help to heal and mend these divisions, many of which are cultural. And I think fewer and fewer of them are truly economic at this point. But that, I think, especially after a really difficult and divisive campaign that I think Americans on all sides felt was stressful and difficult, that's probably the most important thing for the new president to do.
Okay, and Mary, would you agree with that it is unity that's the most pressing issue?
First of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and also to thank Akash for inviting me. Thank you, Akash.
Thanks for coming.
It sounds like we're having a great time next door.
Yeah, whatever's going on.
Yeah, I guess we'll try to give you a good time as well.
That's right.
And I guess you become distinguished when you get gray hair, so you can look forward to that day. It will come sooner than you think. So I partially agree, but I would say that the greatest challenge facing the country, and I agree it would be the same challenge that Clinton faced, is economic growth. You would be surprised what robust economic growth will do to heal the kinds of divisions that Patrick just outlined. Policies have consequences. There are a lot of economists out there that will tell you that this is simply a new normal for America, that we should be content with 1.5% annual growth a year, that there are existential factors out there, demographics, the way our industries are organized, globalization. I mean, you could list it as long as my arm, all of the excuses for this really lousy economy that we're having. But there really actually is nothing normal about this. In fact, it's the consequence of policies. And I think we've seen this throughout history. We've seen it in Europe. We've certainly seen it in Japan. But what we've had over the last 8 years is a reassertion of the state over the economy. And you've had a flood of regulation. You've had higher taxation. You've had a kind of regulatory uncertainty that's really prevented businesses from hiring. And this doesn't affect everybody in the same way. Wall Street has had a fantastic time. I've had a great time as a stock market participant in the Obama economy. He was great for me. But he wasn't great for everybody. And so I think the greatest challenge, by the way, is this a safe space? Can I say things that will offend people? It's not, right? It's not a safe space?
You can say that which you feel.
Fine, I'm going to say what I feel.
I
I think economic policies have been hugely disruptive, particularly to minorities in this country and the poor. Often the same thing, unfortunately. And I think the greatest challenge for Trump is to use the first 100 days of his presidency to lift some of that burden off of private industry, because money doesn't come from nowhere, and if government spends money, it's not free. It comes from taxation or it comes from borrowing, and President Obama did both. And Trump has a mandate for change. He has a mandate to really supercharge growth. But can he do it, and will he do it? And last thing I'll say, we don't know for sure if we're going to get a pro-growth Trump or we're going to get a protectionist Trump that sends the world into global recession. I hope we get the former and not the latter, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. But I noticed there's a distinction between what the two of you said, as often are when great minds are talking. You spoke more of economic prosperity and unity, Mary, whereas Patrick, you touched upon cultural unity also and cultural divisions. And I want to lead into our next question from here, which is, what do you think is the fate of American multiculturalism after this election? I mean, it's not to ask you to be enormously speculative, but the immediate and maybe perhaps more long-term effects of the election, and not just the election of Donald Trump immediately, but going back, the campaigns, the primaries, all of that. What is the effect of that on multiculturalism in America? And as promised, Mary, I think we're gonna give this one to you.
First of all, I don't think we've ever had kumbaya moments in campaigns. I mean, was this a divisive election? Sure, but we've had elections where people were shot. I mean, look, candidates were shot, in fact. So was this campaign, more quote unquote divisive than other campaigns? Maybe, but that could be because we all have, particularly short memories. I mean, again, I would just go back to Obama, who I think has been one of the most racially divisive presidents that we've ever seen. Starting with the comments that he made about the Harvard professor calling the Cambridge police, the comments that he made about the Cambridge police, to claims that, not a safe space apparently, to claims that somehow there's a great conspiracy on the right to deny people their right to vote, which is absolutely bunkum. The Supreme Court, actually a liberal majority plus conservatives in the Supreme Court have said voter ID laws are perfectly constitutional. To Black Lives Matter, which is really premised on a lie, that somehow Michael Brown had his hands up and the police shot him we know for sure that that's simply a fiction, and yet the president has stood behind these people. So I think a large part of healing the divisions in the country is getting a new president. Now, I'm not going to argue that Trump is going to be less divisive than Obama was. It may be in his interest to rile up his base. But I take Trump seriously, but not literally, in the words of Peter Thiel. And I think a lot of the media took him literally, but not seriously. And I think if you look at the way that the campaign has run so far, it's run pretty well. And you actually have the spectacle of a president who's about to go on a unity tour. When was the last time you saw a president do that? When was the last time you saw a president interview cabinet members from every party, including his political opponents? Sure, Obama did that with Hillary, but I have never seen such a wide variety of ideologies, personal backgrounds coming into interview for some of these top offices. So, I'm encouraged. I mean, like everything with Trump, you have to kind of wait and see. But I think, the change in the White House, for one, is a good start, and I think the initial signals from the campaign are positive.
And Patrick, what do you think about the faith of multiculturalism? Are you as optimistic, or?
Just to clarify, faith or fate?
Faith.
Fate. Okay.
No, sorry.
Okay. Well, I mean, America is multicultural, and it's multicultural to a degree that's much more than most other advanced industrial democracies just by our ethnic and demographic makeup. We are at a point in America's history where the share of Americans who are foreign-born is at either a record or near all-time high, certainly since the early 1900s. It's now something like 1 in every 10 Americans is foreign-born. And then we're also a place that's multi-religious, that's multi-racial, and things like rates of interracial marriage or interethnic marriage are at an all-time high. So these are sorts of demographic trends that will not be stopped by any one president or any one party or any one change of power. And so I think the challenge for the country as a whole is how we continue to manage to live together in a way that both acknowledges differences but also grows beyond those differences, because there is an American creed that in fact surveys show immigrants are the most likely to embrace. It's one of opportunity, it's one of belief in having some control over your own destiny, and these are the kind of things that I think both liberals and conservatives can agree make America great, to coin a phrase, as it were. And so I think the fate of multiculturalism is great. I think what this president needs to do is show some ability to be fluent with that multiculturalism and to I would say, figure out ways to encourage bridges among folks of different backgrounds rather than making salient differences. And I think there's a lot of ways to do both, and liberals and conservatives are guilty of doing the former and can be credited for doing the latter. But we'll see what happens under Trump.
I think we can safely say calling Mexicans rapists and murderers was probably not a way to unify the country. And so let's hope he doesn't engage in that rhetoric.
Now, I want to draw a distinction here that sometimes gets passed over, and is that we have the candidate and now President-elect Trump, and then we have those that gain inspiration and influence from his campaign and associated surrogates that have recently been encouraged by his victory, some have argued, to call into question this harmony between communities and our community of community America. We have, there have certainly been here at NYU, we've seen there have been swastikas drawn in the dormitoriums and other scandals similarly. So is there should we be optimistic about this, that this is some post-election surge in these kinds of things, or is it actually maybe a sign of something that's always been there but just hasn't been as brave and confident in itself?
Go first.
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. So I think we are seeing a post-election surge in these kinds of things, and I'm deeply troubled by what I've seen here at NYU. I think it's very much against our principles of community and the kinds of things that we all, I think, as an academic community, try to live by. And I think it's also possible that those sentiments, unfortunately, have always been there and have been given an outlet by the election result. What we saw in the case of Brexit in the UK was something very similar, which was after that unexpected victory by the Leave side in the UK, the number of incidents against different kinds of minorities in that country skyrocketed. And then they subsided. And so my great hope is that that's the kind of thing we're going to see here in the US. The thing to, of course, keep in mind is that it doesn't mean that those sentiments aren't there, and that there are lots of wrong-spirited people who are waiting for opportunities to engage in that kind of behavior and express that kind of opinion. But I also think I guess what I hope is that I have faith in America's institutions and also in our political culture that we, as a people, we don't agree with those things. We don't accept them, and that's true for, I would say, the great majority of white Americans, in addition to people of color here in the U.S. And so those norms, which some would deride as political correctness, and I think it can go too far, and it can be something like political correctness, but norms of tolerance and acceptance and respect for others are ones that I think America was founded on, and ones that we do relatively well compared to other countries around the world. And so I do have some faith that those norms will prevail, and that I'm hoping that these incidents will subside.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. America's an incredibly tolerant country, and I find that a lot of the media coverage tends to omit the broader view of what's actually going on in the society. This is not Jim Crow America, although sometimes if you pick up the New York Times and you look at the front page, you'd be easily convinced that it was, and it's not. There is very little tolerance, as Patrick said, for some of the incidents. So I'm sorry to hear that that's happened at NYU. I wasn't aware that it happened in one of the dormitories. Just to give you a quick statistic, I was thinking about this because of Trump and the murderers and the rapists comment, which was abhorrent. Americans, when they're asked about immigrants, overwhelmingly support more immigration in America. And that is a consistent finding, I think, over many, many decades. So this idea that there's somehow a groundswell against immigration or endorsement somehow of racist views just simply isn't borne out when political scientists and surveyors go out there and they talk to the American people. I'd also note, America solves its problems through its legal system, and if things like this happen, they're usually dealt with rather quickly and in a structured form. We're not a country that tolerates the tyranny of the majority. We don't sort of summarily throw people in jail because we disagree with them, or we don't prosecute them in the court of public opinion. So I'm very thankful that we live here, and I'm not worried about this surge. I certainly don't endorse that kind of behavior, but I don't think that it's representative of us as a nation.
I'll say one other thing about that, which is, look, I'm a Democrat. I worked for Ed Rendell when he was mayor of Philadelphia. So to be clear, I had a preferred candidate in this election. But at this point, I'm primarily a political scientist, and I'm one who I think, like everybody in this room, cares deeply about Americans' institutions, norms, and way of life. And I'm one who strongly believes in its power. And so what I like to tell people about this election is, look, there's a whole realm of normal politics that a lot of liberals and Democrats are not going to be happy with. So if we think about the kinds of picks that Trump has made for, say, Health and Human Services, or the department, talking about Secretary of State or other big cabinet picks, a lot of those people are going to be conservatives that liberals aren't going to like for policy reasons. And all of that is normal, fair play. in politics. And Republicans felt the same way 8 years ago as they saw a number of their cherished policies and ideas get turned over by a liberal administration. The thing that I think we do need to watch out for, and I think this is true regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, is for politics that's outside the door, that is against the institutions and norms of American democracy. And that is, I think, where the line between taking Trump literally and seriously really matters, right? Because if we do take him literally on certain things, there are reasons to be afraid that this is a guy who's not particularly enamored with American democratic norms or institutions. So just, I mean, today, we could all talk about every tweet over and over again, but the one where he said, let's take away the citizenship of people who burn the flag, I mean, that goes against, hundreds of years of constitutional tradition. And so I would say that the one thing that's happened so far, that the action that Trump has taken that has given me pause, and I wonder what you think about it, is his appointment of Steve Bannon as an advisor. And so this is the guy who, I always kind of forget the exact biography, but essentially was the head of a news organization called Breitbart.
Harvard graduate.
Also, right, so Goldman Sachs, Harvard, right. So it's sort of this weird mix of sort of institutional, on one hand, a very sort of standard institutional track, but then also has promoted, provocateur, that I think arguably many of the provocations have a racist tinge to them. And so I would say that as somebody who really tries very hard to be objective and neutral about these things, that's the appointment that troubles me a lot, because I don't think it sends the right signal to a multicultural America that this is a president who wants to unite. I don't know what you think about him.
Yeah, so I guess this is sort of encased in the broader question of who's going to influence Trump when it comes to policy, and because Trump is so unusual in that he doesn't seem to have fixed principles, unlike our previous presidents who had very defined ideologies, that question of who's around him, I think, becomes much more important in this administration than it has in previous administrations. Steve Bannon, as far as we know, has absolutely no anti-Semitic leanings, is not a racist personally, has been very successful in business, was chairman of Breitbart News, which has published some really horrific things, but at the same time has also been very pro-Israel. So what do we make of that? Do we have any evidence at all that this guy supports the provocative stuff that Breitbart has put out, or the pro-Israel stuff, to use one example, that Breitbart has put out? If you want to learn more about him, we did a very long interview with him in the Wall Street Journal last weekend, which I'd be happy to send to any of you if you're not paying for a subscription, which I hope you are. I hope all of you are paying for a Wall Street Journal subscription. But I tend to think that when it comes to big policy decisions, it's going to be Mike Pence that's going to be running that relationship with Congress, simply because Pence is so close to Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, and because there is actually a fixed agenda there in the House called A Better Way, which is really worth looking at if you guys haven't gone and read it, because I do think that that's going to be, in large part, the blueprint for the Trump administration, because it's right there, it's easy, and it also has the agreement of the entire Republican caucus. So that includes the Freedom Caucus and kind of the more traditional classical liberal conservatives, like we would be defined as. And I guess, I keep going back to checks and balances. I mean, let's say that this guy, Steve Bannon, was lying to us at the Wall Street Journal. He's truly an awful guy. He hates all sorts of minorities, and he's pro-terrorist. I mean, you can make up sort of the parade of horribles, and he convinces Trump to go out and do something which is incredibly unconstitutional, like rounding up all of the Somali residents of Minneapolis in the wake of this ISIS attack at Ohio State that we saw this week. First of all, would that be allowed? In other words, would his wishes be carried out? I doubt it. Would Congress pass a law endorsing it, therefore ensuring their political future has been eradicated? Probably not. If he said, let's go ahead and do it anyway, we have checks and balances and we have impeachment. So I don't think Trump would do it in the first place. I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think our system would allow those kinds of abuses, and also I don't think Steve Bannon is a bad guy. I've seen a lot of innuendo in newspapers, but I've never seen evidence to justify the name calling that Steve Bannon has been labeled with.
Could we build off of that checks and balances comment? So most of my generation wasn't alive for it, but when Nixon was caught with the Watergate tapes, his advisor said, after the Supreme Court said, you know, you have to release the tapes, they told him, you should burn them. You should put them on the lawn, set them on fire, and burn them, and say, I disagree with the Supreme Court's review of the interpretation of the Constitution. And I guess it's about these norms that we go with these assumptions that the system, the Supreme Court doesn't have anything beyond its word to defend and enforce its decisions. The enforcement comes from the president. And if the president is claiming that something that was decided 20 years ago in the flag burning cases, that it's completely constitutional to burn the flags, are these norms in danger? I'm opening up to both of you. Is this the signs that somehow the system is shifting towards a more dominant role of the executive? Because we had, during the campaign, both candidates took part in this when they said, what kind of justices do you want to see up in the Supreme Court? Which cases would you want to overturn and keep? Something that normally wouldn't pass the scrutiny of the norms of American politics. So are we moving towards a more authoritarian and dominant executive? I mean, obviously it hasn't happened yet, but is it?
I think it's already happened.
Okay.
President Obama's issued more than 250 executive orders, more than 200, I think, different kinds of executive memoranda, so put that number over 500. The DACA immigration program, completely unconstitutional. Obamacare, also completely unconstitutional, were it not for the media browbeating John Roberts into changing his mind at the last minute. Obama has incredibly centralized power in the White House, I think to varying constitutional degrees. The Iran deal should have been done by treaty. Our founders put the 2/3 majority in place because they wanted our treaties to last between different kinds of administrations. They didn't want one president who was a Republican to sign a treaty and then have the Democrat come in and say, well, I'm not going to honor that. If you're worried about unconstitutional presidencies and tyranny in the Oval Office, I think we've just been through it in the last 8 years. I think that's already been done. There is a question as to whether or not Trump will continue that kind of behavior in the White House. I don't think that he will, because I don't think that that was what he was elected to do. And certainly he hasn't expressed any, in fact, if anything, he said he's going to roll back those actions by the president. He said on day one he's going to use his executive authority to roll back what Obama did, that the courts have deemed unconstitutional. And he said that he may abrogate this Iran deal, which was not done through treaty.
Okay, so you're saying he may not, but Patrick, if he does, is there anything that the American system can do?
Well, we're talking about a whole, kind of portfolio of possible actions. So I think the first thing is political science would probably say that the presidency as a whole, probably starting with Reagan, has sort of taken a number of powers unto itself that were not in its hands beforehand. And I don't think there was a big break with Reagan, but I think if you look over the last couple of decades, you see an increasing use by presidents of both parties for executive actions and memoranda, et cetera. And so we do have this, on the one hand, we do have the president, as an institution, the presidency, doing its best to establish authority and power. At the same time, we also have something in DC that everybody's familiar with, which is partisan gridlock, and an increasing lack of agreement between the two parties on basic aspects of policy, which means that when one controls the White House and the other controls at least one house of Congress, you essentially have very little policy making happening whatsoever. And the reaction there, again, this is political sciences to show this, is that presidents of both parties do what they can to hew out some power in a sort of a tug of war with Congress and other, and for that kind of judiciary, to establish authority and power. So my sense is actually that Trump probably won't need to do that in the first 2 years of the administration, because we're going to have unified government, just like Obama enjoyed unified government for the first 2 years of his administration. The question is what happens if and when Democrats take over Congress or go in the House of Congress and then have some ability to block Trump's initiatives. And that's when the rubber hits the road, and of course that's when we saw what happened with both Bush and Obama when they faced opposition in Congress, is that they were more likely to turn to these kinds of unilateral actions than they had beforehand. But that's, again, I would say some of that is in the realm of normal politics. The stuff that I am a little bit worried about, and I'm glad to hear that you've got some faith in both the checks and balances and the American legal system, is what happens in the wake of a domestic security emergency in the range of 9/11, or God help us, something even worse, which is a situation in which, in theory, there could be actually very strong popular support for the kinds of things that at least I, and I think many Americans, find pretty abhorrent, such as internment camps for Muslim Americans in the wake of an Islamist terrorist attack on New York, Boston, LA, Chicago, Atlanta, and Seattle, right? So, I mean, these kinds of things can happen, and if one thing we know, it's that, terrorist groups like to strike when they think they're going to get the biggest reaction, right? So we can imagine a situation where something like that happens, and that's where I get worried. And I think I'd be worried under any president, because presidents have every incentive to try to look like they're in control, that they're taking command, that they're solving the problem. But I worry about whether our institutions would survive that kind of demand for some kind of solution that is clearly unconstitutional and violates basic citizens' rights. So I want to be optimistic. I want to share your optimism, but I also wish that this president-elect had said a few more things that would increase my confidence in his respect for these kinds of norms and institutions.
Well, that would assume that he's thought about any of these
well, that's
issues,
right.
which
Yeah.
I'm not actually sure that he has.
Yeah.
I mean, on the national security issue, this is a good issue to talk about, because Trump faces, I think, the most chaotic world that we've seen since the end of World War II. In terms of the number of threats, in terms of the type of threats, in terms of the number of nuclear states now that are controlled by what we could call rogue regimes. It's not like the U.S. dealing with the Soviet Union and that nuclear threat. You now have states like North Korea and Pakistan and perhaps Iran, Russia, which has been using some very scary language, China. So he is the possibility that something like that could happen is unfortunately something that I do think that we have to consider. And there is a trade-off between liberty and security. And I think, unfortunately, after 9/11, what emerged was something that we called at the editorial page the anti-terror left, that said, actually, we want more liberty and we want less security measures. In other words, metadata collection, which, by the way, does not violate your privacy at all. We don't like that anymore, and we're going to use it as a political issue to run for office on. And so you saw Republicans agree to downgrade the ability of organizations like the NSA to protect us and to find that needle in the haystack, which is the whole point of our national security apparatus. Is you've got more than 350 million people here in the country. We don't want to violate their constitutional rights, but we need to be able to put together red flags when, say, somebody calls a terrorist in Syria and the same guy has traveled to Pakistan, and by the way, he's going out and buying ball bearings. Well, the NSA today cannot put together a profile to do that for everybody. In fact, Amazon and Google have more information about you than the NSA has. So if, God forbid, that attack did happen, there would be popular calls for security, absolutely 100%. And I hope that day never comes. But that is unfortunately a trade-off. And I don't believe that we would go into a kind of police state. I would hope that wouldn't happen. I think what we're seeing is really the Israelization of America, where Americans are starting to learn to live with the terrorist threat I think we will eventually get to the day when there are no garbage cans in the metro in New York City, and we get used to security checks when we go into malls and we go into restaurants. I think that's the more likely eventual outcome here, unless, God forbid, it was a really horrible attack, in which case we will not be here talking to you, because I work 2 blocks from Times Square, which means I'll be obliterated in a pile of dust if that attack.
At least it'll be instant.
It'll be instant. It'll be
That's the
instant,
upside,
and the attack, yeah, whatever comes.
So much optimism.
But yeah, I know. But one thing I do want you guys to, which Patrick's comments reminded me of, that we will need to watch for is the way that Trump proceeds with these big deals, because he's talking about things like tax reform, for instance, as one of his big priorities in his first 100 days in office. And I think one of the big lessons of the Obama administration is, if you want to do big policy changes, you got to do it in a bipartisan fashion, because if you don't, there's no buy-in from the other side. And when the other side takes power, they're going to have absolutely zero political incentive to keep your policies. And I think Trump and Pence realize this, and I think that they want Democratic support for tax returns, some kind of deal. Tax cuts in exchange for billions of dollars in infrastructure spending, for instance. That's one deal that they could do. And I think the other lesson is that if you issue a lot of executive orders, that's great while you're in power, but when you're not in power, the next guy can just undo them. So I would expect this team to really try to get that kind of bipartisan consensus wherever they can find it, because I think that they want these reforms to be longer lasting than just the 4 years of the first term of the Trump presidency.
Okay, I want to take, this is the last question before we open it up to the audience. A foreign perspective, but not from foreign policy, from a business perspective. So Trump has properties
What a mess.
everywhere. And for someone who has said isolationist things, I don't know how his businesses would fare in an isolationist world, but to what extent will his businesses create a conflict of interest? And how is the American political system supposed to deal with that? Yes.
Can I go first? There's clearly a conflict of interest. My sense is that Americans won't pay much attention to it, and he will suffer very little for it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so look, we knew this throughout the whole campaign. We know it now. It doesn't really seem to have had much of an impact on Americans' assessment of this guy. That's sort of baked in. So my sense is that he will, and his family will profit quite well off of the influence that he has as president. That there's very little we can do about that because you probably need a special prosecutor to be appointed. That's not going to happen under Republican control of Congress. What I do fear is something that I don't think would be good for the country, and even, I think many Democrats, as a Democrat, I would say would be bad, would be some kind of, conflict of interest that was so glaring and so persistent that it led to some kind of impeachment proceedings. Again, that's the idea of him being kicked out of office seems very, very unlikely because of Republican control of both houses of Congress, and you need majorities in both houses to get impeached, to be removed. But I kind of feel like the personal gains that he and his family and his companies will enjoy because he's president is kind of just the price of admission of his presidency. I think Americans they don't like it, but they also are probably going to shrug their shoulders. I don't think there's a whole lot that anything's going to happen with regard to that.
We've advised Trump to liquidate, at the very least, to step away from the business and put it in a blind trust, but you still are left with the question of the kids. And I think it's highly inappropriate for the kids to be sitting in on meetings with heads of state the way Ivanka sat in with Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan. Totally inappropriate, should never happen. Somebody needs to sit down with Trump and tell him that this is just unacceptable. We have anti-nepotism laws for a reason, and I don't think that particular behavior can continue. In terms of the kids running the business and the possibility of quid pro quos, I think that's a real danger. I agree that the American people elected him knowing that these conflicts existed, but that doesn't make them okay. And I don't think there's an easy answer here because the assets are illiquid. You can't sell hotels and golf courses like this. It's not like selling stocks and bonds. It's much more difficult for Trump himself or the Trump children to extricate themselves from the business. Even, let's say that by magic decree, they manage somehow to do this. Donald Trump still knows in his head where all of his businesses are located and all of the favors that he'd like to get from Ireland or the Philippines or Saudi Arabia. So even if you were to liquidate and the kids were to get out somehow, I'm not sure that conflict is really going to go away. So, I hope the media does a great job reporting it. New York Times is running a story a week. I think that's great. Good on them. We're running those stories too. But I think to the best of their ability, they need him to step away from that business, get those kids as far away as possible from the Oval Office, and try their very best to avoid the appearance of the quid pro quo. One last note, though, I can't help it, just because I want to provoke you. I wish the media would have spent as much time investigating the Clinton Foundation and the real quid pro quos as they have, and they're now doing investigating Trump. I'll just leave that there.
But I just want to ask something else that Trump himself seemed to do, which is he valued his name as a brand,
That's the whole value.
right?
That's
And
it.
so he claimed billions of dollars.
Yeah.
So even if he sold his properties, his name still stands on all these hotels and golf courses, and everybody knows.
Except in New York, where they took the name down. But this could be a good thing, because actually, if the Trump value is just his brand, because he doesn't build anything, then that might actually prevent him from doing the kinds of quid pro quos that would damage the brand. Because if that's the value, the quality of the name, then why would you sully the quality of the name? He would actually be incentivized not to do that.
But for someone who wants to claim the legitimacy of the American presidency, if they have Trump's name on their doorstep and he's president of America, doesn't it add a legitimacy? And I don't see how this could easily be separated.
I don't think it is easy. I actually want to go out and order a carton of Trump wine, and I want to get the hats, because I think they might be worth something someday. But no, it's impossible to solve. It's really a hard question. I just, we have finally a media that's interested in probing these kinds of issues magically, and I'm glad that they are.
But do we have an electorate that cares? And it seems like
No, I don't think we do. No, I think, I think we've reached kind of a scandal-fatigued electorate that became convinced that, the final election polls, the electorate was convinced that both candidates were equally dishonest, equally untrustworthy. I'll leave it to you guys to decide if that was actually the case, but clearly he won despite being considered this untrustworthy, and I don't think that that's going to be the kind of thing that turns the American electorate against him. If he can do, he's starting with one of the lower approval and favorability ratings of any new president, and so we'll have to see if he's able to climb out of that. But I think the only way he climbs out of that is through a robust economy, economic growth, and not making the kinds of policy mistakes that are the kinds of things that bring down previous presidents and their approval ratings.
Okay. And so now we're going to open it up to the patient audience. Does anybody have any questions or Mary's words provocations to throw out?
Nothing? I haven't provoked anything.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, good.
I have a question for both of you, but it's premised in something I read.
Could you speak up? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I have a question for both of you, but it's premised in a piece I read from the Wall Street Journal editorial board a while back.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting exactly when it was. It was during the election season, obviously, when you were writing about Trump learning and ascertaining positions and developing an ideology. And I think you and your fellow writers opined that it was insulting to the American people because he didn't show initiative in wanting to learn about these issues that he's confronted with. So in assessing the cabinet in the first 100 days, because he does not, from what we've seen, even with these recent tweets, as you mentioned, with the flag burning, because he doesn't seem, as far as we know, to have gathered all of this information or about norms or institutions or their roles and functioning. How do you see the cabinet filling out, and how do you, with the advice he's getting from these cabinet members and his advisors? I know you both mentioned that you were, there was no clear way to know yet how his ideology would play out, but based on what you've seen from whether it's the state Secretary of State position or the other cabinet positions, what are you seeing when it comes to who's advising him and how his ideology, whether it's porous or more formed, how is that going to play out?
Well, my former colleague Steve Moore, who is an economic advisor to Trump, was in Washington a couple days ago, and he lectured to the Republican caucus that this wasn't Reagan's party anymore. Because of course Ronald Reagan would not be a trade protectionist and would not want to blow out deficits by wasting billions of dollars on infrastructure spending that may have very little effect on economic growth. He is, I think, in his core, a populist. And I think when it comes to his ideas about things like trade, his mind is stuck in 1986 when Japan was going to come in and take over America. In terms of his agenda, what we've been hearing is that the first thing he's going to do is what Reagan did. They're having a great time. I don't know what they're doing or what are they? Yeah, I know what are they talking about.
They're including you.
Yeah, but we know that he's going to sit down and he's going to repeal a lot of regulation that has really shackled our energy industry, and he's probably going to do that on day one, which it will be hugely positive for economic growth. We do know that tax reform is a very, very important priority for them, and that you can probably expect to see that within the first 100 days. So we're starting to see outlines of where he wants to go with policy. And in terms of Obamacare, Trump has indicated that he's fairly flexible about what happens there, right? First it was, we're just going to repeal it. Now the talk is, well, we're going to repeal it, but we're going to delay until we get bipartisan consensus on what we're going to do going forward. In terms of the cabinet picks, it's kind of hard to say because we don't have a full cabinet yet. But I'll just give you one pick that I thought was really fascinating, and that was Betsy DeVos, the education secretary. She was kind of derided as, wow, these people, what are they talking about? I guess the camera can't hear that, but we can. She was sort of derided as, well, she's just sort of a GOP donor, and she's just a rich woman, and he's kind of rewarding his donors. But actually, Betsy DeVos has been in the trenches of education reform for decades. And I think Trump sees education as a completely nonpartisan issue. And to see a statement where he said, we're going to tackle the bureaucracy, and some phrase like that, but then he said, I want school choice for all Americans. That is a revolutionary statement, and that's actually a statement that both parties can get behind, because school choice has been actually a Democratic Party-led initiative in many of the inner cities in America, not a Republican issue. Republicans came to it later. So at least on the education front, we know that he's really serious about reform and opportunity. I think that's terrific. Steve, what's his name? Munchkin?
Yeah.
He's being talked about for Treasury Secretary, and I don't really like that pick. I think Jeb Hensarling would be much more pro-reform, the Texas Republican who's thought a lot about Dodd-Frank. I think overall with the cabinet, last thing I'll say, I talk a lot, sorry, is that I think he's going to run this like The Apprentice. I really do. I think that he's going to put people in conflict with each other in public. He's going to see how they react, and he's going to see how the American public reacts, how the politicians react, and what he thinks of it. But some of these picks I'm pretty encouraged by. But I do think that the cabinet posts are going to matter a little more than usual because of the fact that he's not experienced and he hasn't thought about these issues.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly respond. I think he's probably appointed the most conservative cabinet in a generation, and he's facing the most conservative Congress in a generation. And so what is very likely is a series of both conservative executive orders and policies, with the exception of two things, which are immigration and trade, which will be much more populist. So he will not be taking the Wall Street Journal editorial board's advice on either trade or immigration.
He may take it on trade. He may.
But we are going to see, a real withdrawal of the federal government from the social safety nets. So if you look at the budget and plans that Mary was mentioning earlier, that have basically been passed, I think, 4 or 5 times by the Ryan House. We're looking at a program that will block grant Medicaid, so it will no longer be an entitlement. It will be released to the states, and red states can spend less and blue states can spend more, and that's probably what's going to happen. It will probably block grant food stamps, I believe, as well, and so that will also be a very different program going forward. There's talk about voucherizing and privatizing Medicare and raising the eligibility age. So that would be a very big change to a program that's pretty popular with most Americans in a conservative direction. There's talk about dramatically reducing environmental regulations on the federal level and moving back from things like the Clean Power Plan and other Obama initiatives around global warming. And these things are all, would have been difficult to accomplish with a Democratic Congress. But because we've got at least, again, 2 years of unified government under Republicans, these are all very likely to go forward, and we're going to see a real move to the right in a way that we haven't seen. And I would think it probably can go further than what we saw in the first 2 years of the George W. Bush administration, because he came in with a much more kind of moderate conservative group of folks. We're looking at something that's going to be a very hard turn to the right with a few exceptions. I don't know if you would agree.
Well, Trump actually didn't really talk about entitlement reform during the campaign, which we were kind of horrified at because, entitlement reform is a massive part of the American federal outlays, and it's only growing with time. So at some point, if you're going to have to reform Medicaid and Medicare, you are going to have to raise the age. You're going to have to experiment with ways. And this is some of the idea behind block grants. Block granting to the states doesn't necessarily mean you take away the program. It just says to the states, please do whatever you can to give your recipients better services in as efficiently a way as possible, and spend the money in the areas where you think is best. Sorry, don't get too excited about too entitled. I think Patrick is right. I mean, it is going to be a massive change, but that's what the American people voted for, because they certainly didn't vote for Trump because they liked him. But in any event, sorry, we'll end there. I have a ton of more questions.
You can go back.
So we've heard a lot about economic issues. We've heard a lot about economic and social issues, but one question that I have for both of you regards climate change. Because we've heard Trump talk about the Chinese inventing climate change, and then perhaps having someone appointed to run the EPA that has denounced climate change for a while, and then he went to the New York Times and said, you know what, maybe I'll talk about it, maybe I think differently. So where do you think he lies on that issue? How do you think he will go from when he assumes office, what he will do policy-wise?
Well, first of all, I think you have to be really careful with your language when you talk about climate change. No one denies that climate changes. The debate is over whether or not models, statistical models with thousands and thousands of inputs accurately reflect what man does and whether that has an effect on climate. And I'm not really quite sure that those distinctions are made when you're reading about Trump and his views on climate change. I'm not sure he has fixed views on climate change. Again, back to this last question, I'm not sure he's thought very deeply about any of this stuff. Myron Ebell, the fellow that you refer to, who's been talked about for EPA, but I don't actually think he's been talked about for EPA administrator, is really somebody who I think wants to how can I put this in a way that's meaningful for you? There is really actually a debate about man-made climate change. You wouldn't know it if you just read the New York Times. But you have professors from Princeton, MIT, just to give you a couple of examples, who do not think that man has an effect on the climate. And if they do, it's a minuscule amount. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to see the Trump administration come in and look at policies and say, does this make sense from a risk-reward perspective? Meaning, is this going to have a meaningful impact on the climate? I had a number, because I thought you might ask me this question. Clean Power Plan costs more than $7 billion a year for very little, if not meaningless, impact on the global climate. Would you rather spend $7 billion a year on something that's not going to impact climate change, or should we use that money to Medicaid recipients in Rhode Island? I don't know, but I think they're going to start to ask those questions, whereas I think the Obama administration didn't. And they implemented a lot of policies that didn't do much good for the climate, but that actually hurt a lot of people because they were thinking about impacts 100 or 200 years from now, while you have lousy economic growth that had meaningful impacts today on a lot of poor and out-of-work people in America. So I think the priorities are going to shift.
So with regard to climate change, I'll respectfully disagree with my new friend Mary
Yes.
about the scientific consensus on climate change. I would say the proportion of climate scientists who think that climate change is not man-made is equivalent to the proportion of economists who are communists. In that they do exist, but they represent a tiny sliver of the scientific consensus on this particular thing. And it would be as if I were to go to the Wall Street editorial board and say, well, there are communist economists who do not believe in the law of supply and demand. It's a very similar kind of story. But we'll put that difference aside and just think about the implications of Trump's election for climate change. And I think there you are going to see, I would definitely agree that Trump does not appear to have fixed views on this issue. And my sense is he's going to listen to the Republican Party consensus, which is much more skeptical of whether climate change is even happening in the first place, let alone whether it's caused by, well, I think...
Not climate change,
yeah.
because everybody agrees that climate change.
Not a majority of Republican voters in surveys. Yeah, so survey Republican voters, a majority disagree that it's happening at all, which is really something. So what we can expect to see, I think, is a retrenchment in terms of any kind of federal initiative from the executive branch on climate change. But what's kind of interesting is to think about what happens when different regulations on energy creation are removed. So one way to think about the kinds of promises that Trump has made about removing restrictions on, say, fracking is that, according to the laws of supply and demand, one of the industries that's likely to be hurt by that is coal. In that as long as you make natural gas cheaper, you make coal relatively more expensive and demand goes toward gas instead of coal. It turns out, if you're a climate change person, you'd rather have energy come from natural gas than from coal. So there actually may be second-order effects of these kinds of shifts that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and could have some kind of effect on reaching, say, the goals in the Paris Agreement or what have you. I'll say one more thing, which is, we're seeing all kinds of indications from Trump that there's deep, deep skepticism toward any kind of international cooperation, whether that includes climate change treaties or NATO, TPP, et cetera. And so climate change, I think, will be one of the various areas in which U.S. international cooperation recedes, and that, again, will be part of sort of a wide range of international issues that the U.S. will probably be less of a player in than it was under Reagan, Bush, or Obama.
Okay, next, yes.
This question's probably directed more at Mary, but obviously both welcome. It's twofold. One, I guess I wanted your insight, or you as sitting on the editorial board with Trump's calls for the untrustworthy media, things like that, and then the sort of the development and surge of fake news in general that has occurred that has appeared in this election and seems to still continue. I think it was only this week that one tweet had set off the firestorm of news. I can't remember the story. But then the second question is more, I guess, as sitting on the editorial board and with the National Press Club's open letter to Donald Trump and him preventing press pools, blacklisting reporters, do you see that changing in his administration? Do you see him staying transparent? There's even been calls in the Obama administration for Obama taking too much of the news and using the White House social media platforms and media platforms instead of giving it to the press. I guess, how do you see Trump's relationship with the press evolving, especially once he's inaugurated, but also the fake news question?
I think this administration is going to leak like a sieve. I think that we are going to get a lot of disgruntled Trump people talking to the press. And the bureaucracy certainly isn't going to like Trump at all. The bureaucracy is vastly dominated by Democrats, and they're going to leak all the time. So, you know, a president can do whatever he wants to shut off access to the administration, but there are a lot of other ways to get information. So I'm not as concerned about that. I think if there is news, then journalists are going to find it. And actually, I would argue that the National Press Corps is more motivated to find scandalous stories about Donald Trump and that administration than they would be about Hillary Clinton, because the press corps is dominated by Democrats. So I think the press will do its job, and I think it'll do a good job, regardless of what the White House does. In terms of fake news, I mean, we've had yellow journalism in this country for hundreds of years. The fake news scandal is a fake scandal. And I'm not really concerned about it at all. And also, by the way, you know, we live in a country with hundreds of thousands of news sources, and they're proliferating every day. I mean, I think the American consumers have vast access to information, far more than a place like, say, Britain. I mean, if you've ever lived in Britain and you've turned on, the television there with state-controlled BBC, you're not getting a conservative point of view. It's very difficult, and their media is very limited, and it's not as vibrant, and it's much easier to sue people for libel. So if anything, I mean, I think you're, in America, even if you thought the fake news scandal was real, you'd have a far greater ability here to suss out the truth than you would anywhere else in the Western democracies. So I think that answers your question.
Follow-up?
Yeah, I'll just add that my sense is that the institutions of the media, the sort of the well-resourced institutions that can do the kind of in-depth reporting and investigation of government public affairs is receding. I mean, so we have lots of, I would agree that we are in an era of sort of unlimited numbers of sources for news and especially opinion about politics. The thing that does concern me from sort of a democratic norms and institutions standpoint is that we have less and less resources going to the kind of objective, investigative journalism that is often the kind of thing that keeps government, again, Democrats and Republicans, honest. There's lots of talk that next year we're going to see huge rounds of layoffs and cutbacks. There's talk of the New York Times cutting back its the number of sections it publishes. The Wall Street Journal just did that. I do fear for a future America where the kind of the well-resourced media institutions that can do in-depth journalism have a much smaller footprint than they have in the past. I think that would be dangerous.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Do you remember Ben Rhodes' comment that, did you guys see this, where he said, he was asked about foreign coverage of foreign affairs, and he said, well, I'm just dealing with 27-year-olds who've never left the country, so I can basically tell them whatever I want, and they have no way of knowing that I'm lying, spinning them, which is another word for telling them a half-truth. So that is a big concern, the fact that you don't have people overseas, and you don't have these expansive budgets. I think I agree with Patrick that is a big change.
Okay, so we have to wrap up, but before we do, I just want to ask one final question and it builds off of these 2 points, which is many people are talking about...
It's a struggle session. it's like Red China. We've got like denunciations here. Yeah, perfect.
That's why I'm speeding it up so we can all go there.
Awesome.
No, so there's a lot of talk of us living in a post-factual world now, where we've come to the point where nothing is given and everything is a bipartisan issue. Not to be literalist here, but a lot of things seem to suggest that there's much more debate about facts now and the truth, because the internet, which we thought would have made it easier to ascertain the truth, has actually made it it's not any easier at all. I'm not going to say it's harder, but it's not easier to ascertain the truth. So I wonder, what do you think our role is as students in a research university? How do we deal with this movement in our country and maybe around the world to live in this post-factual world? What are we supposed to be a pessimist, an optimist, or a realist? I don't know. I'm gonna maybe Patrick. I feel like you have something to say.
Yeah. So, well, I think it's a couple things. So the idea that we live in a kind of a post-fact world, there's a lot of different ways to kind of interpret that or to test that or ask that question. So I'm not going to come down on either side of answering that question. I did see this. Somebody made a great statement, which is, you don't see fake sports news or fake business news because those consumers actually really care about getting the facts right. Whereas with politics, people bring their own opinions and prejudices to the table, and so they're very happy to hear the facts that kind of align with their pre-existing predispositions, right? So this gets to the point where I worry a little bit less than some of the alarmists about the post-fact world, which is, it's not clear to me that the absence of facts is leading people to change their minds, because my sense is that we have a world of such strong political alignments and predispositions that people aren't really changed one way or the other by learning facts. So I assume most of you here are students who are interested in politics and public affairs. Maybe you're one of our politics majors or minors. And I think what this calls upon us to do is really to redouble our commitment to analysis and facts in a way that is accessible and engaging to wide audiences, and to be aware of the kinds of biases and prejudices that we bring to analysis, to try to put them aside and to make the best faith effort to come to solutions about public policy problems and public affairs questions that enhance the greater good. Now, I don't know, maybe that sounds like a safe space kumbaya thing to say, but it is actually the kind of principles that I bring to the research I do and certainly the teaching I do, and it's the kind of values that I hope to impart in students when I teach. So I guess it's going to be kind of an obvious answer since I'm an academic, but it sort of, my sense is it's, now more than ever, we have to be committed to seeking truth and objective analysis to the kinds of problems we face, and to bring that out to the world.
Wow, great answer. I mean, I just echo Patrick and say, you can always go to primary sources. If you have a question about, what did Obama do to the federal debt, you can go online and you can see there are government websites that show you that in black and white. You don't have to read the young adult website, Vox.com, to get an answer on that. And you can go and find that out yourself. That 98% of all scientists who believe in the climate change number, if you go and look at the actual survey, it's total bunkum. There is a debate. I'm provoking Patrick here, but you can go back and you can look at those surveys, and I would encourage you to do that. I mean, I think what I would want everyone to do is to learn how to think critically and to study history. I'll give you one, and I'll tell you why I said that, because I see some raised eyebrows. I was really truly amazed this weekend when Castro finally kicked the bucket and headed down to hell. To see Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau really lionize this monster, because he knows clearly nothing of history and the kind of person that Castro was and the horror that he inflicted on Cuba, and apparently thinks that there's some part of that monster that brought great healthcare and education to Cuba, which is total fiction and propaganda in the Cuban regime. But because he, didn't learn any history and he can't think critically, he put out a statement that got him ridiculed around the world. I would really encourage you to really explore why you think what you think. If you believe in universal healthcare and you thought Obamacare was a great thing, well, why? Why do you believe that healthcare is a right? If you think we should have higher taxes and that that's fair, okay, that's fine. But have an argument to substantiate that view. And have a look at history and examine how nations who have followed those paths have actually performed. And see if your views line up with what the real world experimentation has shown. I can't tell you the number of people I meet who will repeat slogans to me. I can't think of slogans now, but yeah,
Exercise them.
exercise them, and really, explore the sources and come to your own conclusions. We read widely and talk to people who may not agree with you, but really do your own work and do your own thinking, and don't just read newspaper headlines in our paper or anybody else's paper and repeat them mindlessly. Really try to explore why you think what you think. And I hope you come to our editorial page for a particular point of view, for the free market, free people point of view. You may disagree with us, but hopefully you will always get a cogent argument from us that is based on facts and based on primary sources. So I'll just leave it at that and go buy a subscription to the Wall Street Journal when you can afford one.
And I'll add one thing that I know we all agree on, and it's the spirit of what gathers us in this room, is not only a commitment to learning the facts and having critical thinking, but also a commitment to open and free dialogue. And that, I think, is something that, as I understand what the Review and Debates does, is a great thing about this group and about good academic institutions. And that's something that's, I think, we also need now more than ever in a society that feels very fractured in the West.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of the semester. We'll see you next semester. Take care.
Twitter is my new medium.
All right, great.
Oh, do I?